5 elements.
What?
Proving fraud consists of 5 elements.
Bank fraud.
Goddamn fraud.
Mail fraud.
Tax fraud.
Felony fraud.
What do you want me to do?
I want you to stay on the civil case.
Break some more laws like you did when you hired the fraud. You went out on your own, you hired a fraud.
I may have hired a fraud, but you're the one who had the chance to turn him in. I may have hired a fraud, but you're the one who had the chance to turn him in. And you used his secret to get what you always
Mr. Litt,
wanted. So don't come
I'm
here.
sorry to interrupt, but your cousin Gertrude's on the phone.
Fraud case. Just denied our motion to seal.
You're a fraud? Word gets out that a senior staff is a fraud, they're gonna start bleeding clients.
Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud. Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud. You're a fraud.
Relax. That's not gonna happen to you.
You're a fraud.
Fraud. Fraud. Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud. Fraud. Fraud. Fraud.
You are a fraud.
What are you talking about, Lewis?
Fraud. 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 The fraud. Fraud.
She's never gonna think that Mike's a fraud.
Mike Ross is a fraud.
Fraud. Fraud.
But you know I'm a fraud.
What?
I'm a fraud. 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 Fraud.
You're a fraud. Fraud.
A lawyer?
A fraud.
I'm not a lawyer. In fact, between you and me, I'm a complete fraud. I'm a fraud.
You're not a fraud, Mike. Just never went to law school.
Michael James Ross,
Yes?
you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud.
I hired a fraud.
Wire fraud.
Bingo.
And no matter what he says, the fact is, Mike Ross is not a lawyer. He's a fraud.
The defense would like to call its first witness.
Right there. He's such a non-lawyer, he doesn't even know the prosecution goes first.
Mike Ross is a fraud.
He's fraud.
Don't worry, Donna. She won't ask you point blank if you knew Mike was a fraud.
But I am guilty of being a fraud.
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 How many times do I have to tell you?
You're a goddamn fraud.
Fraud.
Okay.
I don't like fraud. Fraud. Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud. There's no fraud. Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud. Fraud.
Fraud. Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud. Fraud.
Fraud. Fraud.
You were a fraud.
Fraud man.
Hire an unqualified fraud? I did that already.
Being an ass doesn't make me guilty of fraud.
Potential fraud. Potential fraud. Fraud. Commit that fraud.
Committing another fraud to cover your fraud?
Fraud. I'm not sitting in the back with a fraud.
Fraud?
Like you thought they had me for being a fraud?
Felony fraud. I'm investigating you for felony fraud. It wasn't fraud.
Fraud. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of fraud.
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 I am not a fraud.
A fraud.
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 It's a fraud.
He's a fraud.
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 I should have known a guy who would hire a fraud.
Fraud claim against you.
Fraud.
Fraud.
Fraud. Fraud.
Better than a fraud.
I think it's time for some new material.
For more Broken videos, please subscribe. Tell us on the comments below the song and the repeated line or word you would like to see in a Broken Montage, and we will work the most popular ideas. Thank you for watching.